Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. My name is Joe Rubenstein and it is Wednesday, March 28th, and we made it. Tomorrow is opening day. Let that sink in for a second. Feels pretty good, huh? You can follow us on Twitter at Bombers Podcast is the handle. You can like us on Facebook as well. Subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher, and you can send your comments and questions to joe@bronxbomberspodcast.com or give us a call at 646-854-4959. Really, however you'd like to engage with us. We love engaging with you. Coming up later on here in this episode, and it'll take up the entirety of this episode 10, made it to double digits, not bad. Part 2 of our Major League season preview this week as we talk about the American League and get you caught up on all 15 teams, how they did this offseason, and whether they are contenders, pretenders, or undergoing a full-on rebuild, and if it is a rebuild, how they're doing with that. The American League right after this.
Bronx Bombers Trivia. Mickey Mantle hit a record 18 World Series home runs in his career. Which Yankee is in second place with 15? Is it A, Babe Ruth, B, Yogi Berra, C, Bernie Williams, or D, Reggie Jackson? The answer coming up a little bit later in the podcast.
And now here's Joe with this week's main thing.
Well, after 10 weeks of hardcore analysis and numbers crunching and ranting and raving, the offseason has drawn to a close and we are now ready for a brand new season in Major League Baseball, which means the time has come to put the money on the table and place our bets as to where each of these teams will stand at the end of September. Last week, we covered the National League, and one of my picks actually may have already taken a hit. I had Milwaukee and San Francisco facing off in the NL wildcard game, but the Giants got some terrible news over the weekend that Madison Bumgarner, their frontline starter, has a fractured hand after getting hit by a line drive and will now be out for 6 to 7 weeks. And another pitcher on that staff, Jeff Samardzija, will miss a month with a pectoral strain, so all is not well out in Frisco. We'll see if that lineup, which has been hitting well this spring, can overcome those two losses. But this week, we set our sights on the American League, and without further ado, let's dive right in, starting with the AL West. And my pick for last place in that division is the Oakland Athletics. Now, the A's definitely fall into that full-on rebuild category, although I kind of feel like they've been rebuilding for the last 10 years. A handful of good players and just a ton of unproven prospects. But if you want a cold-eyed assessment of what we'll see on the field this year out in Oakland, it's sort of the opposite of my fourth-place team, which I'll reveal in a minute, in that the A's have some decent pitchers, but a lineup that's pretty anemic. Although they did sign catcher Jonathan Lucroy a couple of weeks ago, and that was a good pickup. He was really good down the stretch last year after he was traded to Colorado. On-base percentage .429 last third of the season, and he was one of the main reasons why the Rocks made it to that wild card game. But the A's, I don't know, man, they're hard to predict. On the one hand, they only won 75 games last year, okay? But on the other, they can be unexpectedly tough. They swept us on one of those endless West Coast road trips, and they also went 17-7 to close out the season. And honestly, they've made a couple of nice additions beyond Lucroy. They signed former Angel reliever Yusmeiro Petit to a 2-year, $10 million deal, and he was one of the better arms in the Angels' bullpen last year, 91 innings, 2.76 ERA. So I thought that was a nice pickup, and their farm system is, I would say, one of the better ones in baseball. I think they're currently ranked 12th or around there, with a nice balance of pitching and hitting, and they've got a couple of ex-Yankee prospects, outfielder Dustin Fowler, right-hander James Caprillion, and Jorge Mateo. I think of those three, the one to keep an eye on this year is Dustin Fowler. Before he was called up last year and shredded his knee in that horrible incident in Chicago, he hit .293 with 40 extra base hits and 313 plate appearances in AAA, and it looks like he'll be the A's center fielder for the indefinite future. Manager Bob Melvin will start him in center field tomorrow on opening day at home against the Angels. And in one of their earliest moves this offseason, the A's made a trade with St. Louis. The Cardinals had too many outfielders, after picking up Marcell Ozuna from the Marlins. So they sent right fielder Stephen Piscotty to Oakland in exchange for a pair of infield prospects, but not top prospects. So a decent deal for Oakland, which is par for the course for Billy Beane. Now, Piscotty was off last year, but a lot of that was because of a hamstring injury. And there were some personal issues too. His mother, who lives in the Bay Area, was diagnosed with ALS. So now that he's in Oakland, he'll be able to spend time with her as well. And he's got talent. 2 years ago in St. Louis, 343 on base, 22 home runs, 85 RBIs. So I'd say he's the best outfielder right now for Oakland, certainly the most proven. Now, the other big deal that Oakland made was shipping first baseman Ryan Healy to Seattle in exchange for shortstop prospect Alexander Campos and right-handed reliever Emilio Pagan. Time will tell, but I think Oakland may have gotten the better of that deal as well. Healy, in his last 2 seasons in Oakland, has terrible on-base numbers, although he did hit 25 home runs last year. And Pagan, who was a centerpiece of Oakland's return in that deal, is coming off a pretty good season. So with Petit and Pagan, the A's bullpen should be somewhat improved this year. And Campos, the other guy they picked up as a shortstop, he's a decent prospect. He was ranked 10th in the Mariners organization. So look, it's a fairly tough division. It's a very tough division. Obviously, you've got Houston up top and poised to have another big year. The Angels are improved. And Oakland, will have to deal with the NL West in interleague play this year. So interesting to watch? Yes. But I'm giving them 76 wins, same as last year. That's an overpick, by the way. Vegas has them at 74.5. And 76 is just one fewer than the 77 I'm giving my pick for 4th place in the AL West, the Texas Rangers, and that's an overpick as well, but just by half a game, and actually would be a 1-win decline from last year when they also finished in 4th place. Texas is definitely one of those middle-of-the-road teams, not rebuilding but not contending, sort of like St. Louis. So they signed 2-time Cy Young winner Tim Lincecum a couple of weeks ago as kind of a reclamation project, hoping to use him in late innings, but the word is he's not going to be ready for opening day, still trying to find his location. But the Rangers are sort of half a team. Like I said, the opposite of Oakland. Terrible pitching, but a decent lineup, actually better than decent. Joey Gallo, 41 home runs, 80 RBIs last year. 38-year-old Adrian Beltre is having a great spring. But he's one of those aging sluggers that's kind of weighing down his team's flexibility with a massive contract. But he's a team leader, and although he only played 94 games last year, missing the first couple of months with a leg injury, 17 home runs, 71 RBIs, good on-base guy too. Sin-Soo Choo, who's usually a DH, although I've seen him play outfield a bit, 22 home runs last year. But again, they've got a ton of money tied up in these guys, so it's pretty much sink or swim with the roster they've got. And their pitching staff, like I said, is pretty dreadful, or at the very least, full of question marks. They're going to go 6-man rotation, which will be interesting, but I think Texas fans are wishing it was a 6-man rotation with 6 different men. They're going to try to milk some more production out of the seemingly ageless Bartolo Colon. Actually, he does have an age. It's 44. And Texas hopes they can see the better side of guys like Doug Fister, who was terrible last year in Boston, Cole Hamels, who was bad as well, ERA close to 5, Mike Minor, and Matt Bush. So names not to inspire a great deal of confidence. Obviously, they lost Darvish, first to the Dodgers and now a Cub. They also lost Andrew Kashner, now in Baltimore, and so the Rangers were also interested in Shohei Ohtani, but considering how awful Ohtani has looked, and maybe it's just as well they passed, or he passed, but even so, the Rangers have an entire rotation of aging arms in various stages of decline, although Mike Minor's an interesting case because he pitched out of the bullpen last year in Kansas City and was actually one of their best relievers, but the Rangers picked him up with the idea that he'd be a starter. And he's had a bunch of shoulder problems, so we'll see how he handles the extra workload. But I guess worst case scenario, they can stick him back in the pen. The Rangers also added a couple of half-decent arms to the bullpen, ex-Angel Jesse Chavez and Tony Barnett. I mean, they did address, to some extent, the area where they desperately need to improve, which is pitching. But the guys they picked up really aren't great, and they lost a solid guy in Kashner and obviously in Darvish as well. But again, Texas does not have really any financial flexibility as things stand. They also do not have a great farm system. In fact, it's ranked in the bottom 3rd in the American League. Only Baltimore, Boston, Seattle, and Kansas City are worse. And they still have 4 players, Hamels, Chu, Beltre, and Elvis Andrus, making at least $15 million. So combined, that's more than the entire opening day payroll of at least 3 teams. So don't be surprised if the Rangers start to deal some of these players, especially Beltre, who's in his walk year. And once they unload some of these contracts, then and only then will they be in good position to start a proper rebuild. All right, the next team we take a look at, my pick for 3rd place out west, the Seattle Mariners, a team still looking for their first AL pennant after 41 years of existence. A few productive players in 2017, Robinson Cano, Nelson Cruz, Kyle Sager, all 3.5 wins above replacement. But on the whole, just kind of blah. I mean, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with that front office. GM Jerry Dipoto a year ago made, I think, 14 off-season trades, which I believe was a major league record. They added 18 new players to the 40-man roster, but the whole thing was a net negative. Now, one positive last year, catcher Mike Zunino broke out. He hit for power. He's been killing it in spring training. But last year he had career highs in pretty much every offensive category. The second best catcher in the American League, behind only Sanchez. I think Mike Zunino is a star in the making, but if you had to point a finger at the one reason for Seattle's mediocrity in 2017, and this is really a common theme for most of the bad teams last year, maybe every year, the starting rotation just could not stay healthy. It was like a never-ending parade to the DL. They ended up using a major league record 40 pitchers last year. That's insane. And probably their 2 best starters, James Paxton and Felix Hernandez, combined for just 223 innings. And King Felix, that crown continues to gather rust. He's not a shadow of his former self at this point. But like Texas, the Mariners have an expensive, aging core. So if I was Dipoto, I'd face the music and do what the Tigers and the White Sox are doing and commit to a rebuild sooner rather than later, and maybe trade for prospects if they're out of it in July, which I think they will be. Now, the big move they made this offseason was that trade with Miami for second baseman Dee Gordon, which was kind of a head-scratcher, honestly, because they already have Robinson Cano, who they're paying an absolute fortune. But they announced they're going to play Dee Gordon in center field. Remember, they lost Gerard Dyson in free agency to Arizona. And, Gordon's a good on-base guy, and he's fast as greased lightning and will definitely, make a good leadoff hitter, which they desperately need. But he hasn't played a single inning in his entire career in center field. So an interesting experiment, kind of bizarre, but, I guess his speed, which is obviously a crucial piece of any center fielder's skill set, is what makes this maybe an okay decision. Although a couple of prospects that Seattle gave up in that deal to get him were upper tier, actually, and Gordon's owed $38.5 million over the next 3 seasons. So I don't know. Dipoto looks like a man without a plan. But other than signing pitcher Juan Nicasio to a 2-year, $17 million deal, it was a pretty quiet offseason for them. So I see no reason why we should see any significant improvement for Seattle this year. And, Robinson Cano, he got his money, but whether or not he ever plays a postseason game the rest of his career is an open question. And I've got the M's winning 1 fewer game than last year, so 78, which is an underpick. Vegas has them at 81.5 for reasons I fail to comprehend. Every year, everyone is always high on Seattle and St. Louis until they're not. Moving on to a much improved team by contrast, my pick for second place, the Los Angeles Angels, and along with Minnesota in the Central and Milwaukee and San Francisco in the National League, one of the most improved teams in the majors. First thing they did was sign left fielder Justin Upton to a long-term deal. I thought that was really important to keep that power in their lineup. And then a couple of big-time additions in Ian Kinsler and Zach Cozart. And they've got some pitchers that are returning healthy as well. Garrett Richards, Matt Shoemaker, and Tyler Skaggs. Tyler Skaggs, that's a great name for the lead singer in a southern rock band. But Garrett Richards, after some strong years out there early in his career, is coming off a nightmarish 2 years after a torn UCL. He didn't have Tommy John, he did stem cell therapy, but countless hours of rehab, and then got hurt again last year with a very unusual biceps nerve issue. But he's ready to go, and Shoemaker, who was on the wrong end of a dreadful situation 2 years ago, he got hit in the head by a 105-mile-an-hour line drive and ended up with a skull fracture and a hematoma. I've always wondered why that doesn't happen more often, but I'm certainly glad it doesn't. But that ended his season, and he was injured again last year as well. So hopefully this will be a renaissance for a staff that has undergone some major challenges. And Ohtani, who came to the Angels never having faced major league hitters and was listed for reasons I know not as the number one prospect in all of baseball. I mean, yeah, great numbers in Japan, but the quality of competition there is not remotely comparable. And we've seen mediocre major league players go over there and put up great numbers. And there was some debate even the past week or so. I think his ERA is up around the 27 mark, okay? He's been getting destroyed. But there was some question of whether he'd even make the big league club or need some seasoning in the minors. That's what I would do, try to rebuild his confidence down there in the minors. But Bob Nightingale at USA Today reported that he will indeed be part of the opening day roster for Los Angeles, and the expectation is that he'll DH tomorrow against the A's and then pitch 2 days later, which should be interesting. But, this whole Ohtani thing could be one of the most overhyped situations of all time. Not only has he been getting shelled, but his hitting has been atrocious. He's hitting 107 this spring in 28 at-bats with 9 strikeouts. So look, it's not like the Angels have a ton of money tied up in him. But still, maybe a blessing in disguise that, he never came to New York. They're a lot more patient out there in Anaheim with the sunshine and the good vibes and all that type of stuff. But, big picture, GM Billy Epler certainly gave it his best shot this winter as far as building a high-level group around Mike Trout. Kinsler is an upgrade at second base. Not what he once was. Actually, very bad numbers last year. But the 3 prior seasons, he was one of the best in the bigs. But if Kinsler doesn't work out for whatever reason, he's in the last year of his contract, so not a big risk. And Zach Cozart, who's a natural shortstop, but he'll play third base in L.A. The Angels have the best defensive shortstop in baseball, in my opinion, in Andrelton Simmons. But Cozart, as I discussed last week in my segment on the Reds, breakout season last year, on base 385, 24 home runs. So that's another upgrade over the combination of Yunel Escobar and Luis Valbuena from last year. A bit of an adjustment defensively for Cozart. There's actually a really funny story about Zach Cozart. Last season on the Reds, first baseman Joey Votto promised him the gift of a donkey if he made the All-Star team, which he did. And so a donkey was indeed presented to Zach Cozart, and the Reds paraded this donkey, whose name is Amos, around the Great American Ballpark back in July. Classic baseball. That kind of weird stuff, it doesn't happen in other sports. And that whole incident was probably the highlight of the Reds' year, maybe the decade. But Cozart, like Amos the donkey, has moved on to greener pastures. And look, the Angels are not the Astros, okay? They are imperfect, especially the rotation. But for my money, they're a strong contender for the wild card this year, and I'm going to give them 85 wins, just over Vegas, who has them at 84.5. So on to Houston, who at least on paper certainly have as much talent as any team in baseball. The only question, which I discussed a bit back in episode 7, was this issue of a potential World Series hangover, especially for the pitching staff, which is one of the older staffs around. And one of the elder statesmen on that staff, 34-year-old Charlie Morton, who was great in the postseason, got absolutely shelled by the Marlins last week. Yeah, the Marlins. 11 hits, 3 walks, 9 earned runs in just 3 innings. I was shocked Hinch kept him in. He really got worked over by that young Miami team. Look, it's one game, and if it was a game that counted, he certainly would have been pulled. But honestly, as a Yankee fan, that's the sort of thing I'm looking at as a potential crack in Houston's armor. And then also, as I said, the division is more competitive, with the Angels a very different ball club. And it may seem like a small thing, but I don't think it is. Not with the Yankees and Astros so close in talent. The Astros have to play the Dodgers, Giants, Diamondbacks, and Rockies in interleague play, while we get the Marlins, Braves, Phillies, and Mets. It's a big difference. And as far as Houston's bullpen, not only is it nowhere near the Yankees, it may not even be much better than last year. I mean, they picked up Hector Rondon this winter, who got absolutely shelled, ERA near 10, and then the Astros shut him down because of fatigue, supposedly. And former Indian Joe Smith, that's an upgrade, no doubt about it. Joe Smith is good. but they still don't have a real quality lefty in that pen. And Ken Giles, their closer, is a thrill a minute in a bad way for them. Really bad in the postseason last year. That's why you saw Morton and McCullers pitching in relief in the World Series. Although Brad Peacock, who was effective as a starter last year, will start this season in the pen. So that's a net positive for their back end. He's pretty good too. But look, if healthy, they have a really good starting five in that rotation, especially up top with Verlander and Keuchel. I like McCullers as well. And as far as position players, no real weaknesses. It's a phenomenal lineup, no question about it. And they didn't make any adjustments there whatsoever, which was correct. They had the best offense overall in baseball last year. And now one problem for them to start is that first baseman Yuri Gurriel had hand surgery and will be out for the first couple months of the season. They'll most likely use utility man Marwin Gonzalez to fill in for him. But as much as it pains me to say it, the Astros have as good a shot as anyone to win it all this season. Although, again, that hasn't been done since the Yankees did it in 2000, a repeat. And for a couple of the reasons I just outlined, I predict a bit of a drop-off in their win totals. I've got the Astros at 96, so a 5-win drop-off. But I'd be completely shocked, delighted but shocked, if the Astros didn't run away with the AL West. Moving on to the AL Central, which, as with all three divisions in the American League, has two good teams and three in various stages of disrepair. And we start with the worst of those three. My pick for last place with 66 wins, your Chicago White Sox, who are at least doing it the right way. Total tear down and rebuild. Now, as far as talent in 2018, they have first baseman Jose Abreu. Great year last year, 33 home runs, 103 RBIs. And I'm assuming since the White Sox didn't deal him during this rebuild that they're going to extend him. But the good news for White Sox fans is they have a totally revamped farm system after neglecting it for years. I mean, it's slightly thinner as we speak, because they've graduated so many prospects to the bigs this year. But even so, it's ranked at number 7 in baseball, whereas just 3 years ago, they were ranked 5th worst. So things have changed pretty quickly on the south side of Chicago. And with their prospects, some acquired from the Yankees in that deal last summer for Robertson and Canely, they have strong position players, especially outfielders, and strong pitchers as well. So they're going to take their time, develop these young players, build a core, and when the time is right, make some free agent moves, but that's likely 2 or 3 years away. Their top prospect is outfielder Eloy Jimenez, who they got in the trade with the Cubs for starter Jose Quintana. Jimenez has serious power and all-star potential. Now, Chicago's bullpen will not be a strength in 2018. Again, Robertson and Canely to New York last July. The White Sox also lost Anthony Swarzak to free agency. He's now a Met. But Chicago did try to counteract some of those bullpen losses in January by shipping out second baseman Jake Peter to the Dodgers and getting right-handers Luis Avilan and Joakim Soria. That was actually a 3-team deal with the Dodgers and the Royals. So Avilan and Soria give them some veteran depth on the back end, although neither are at the level of Robertson or Canely. And the only position player they signed was catcher Wellington Castillo. Journeyman, decent defensively. That was for 2 years and $15 million. And from what I understand, the point of that acquisition was to have a veteran backstop to handle all these young pitchers, which kind of makes sense. And the White Sox really have very few contractual obligations at this point, so why not, So I think if White Sox fans can be a little patient, they have a good shot at seeing an exciting team in a couple of years. The farm system is totally loaded, and Chicago, who will definitely be bad this year, could be inching up the power rankings in the not-so-distant future. Next up, a team with a very similar profile, actually, the Detroit Tigers, like Chicago, full-on rebuild mode. And like Chicago with Abreu, they have a really good veteran who's apparently sticking around, Miguel Cabrera, future Hall of Famer for sure. Career on base 395. That's pretty incredible. Although he is coming off the worst season of his career with some back issues. But I gotta be honest, despite Cabrera's happy-go-lucky rep, I find him actually kind of annoying. I thought he totally instigated that ridiculous bench-clearing brawl last year by riling up the White Sox bench because a couple of Yankee pitchers hit batsmen, I think by accident. I mean, the Yes cameramen caught him going up and down the dugout, yelling at his teammates to do something. And I think one of those pitchers for the Yankees was Betances. And Betances, at that point in the season, couldn't hit the side of a barn. It clearly wasn't intentional. But I'm going to make a little prediction that little set-to between the Tigers and the Yankees is not over. I think we'll see a sequel this year. Just a hunch. But a much stronger hunch is that the Tigers will be very bad this year. I'm giving them just 3 more wins than the White Sox, so 69. That's actually an over. Vegas has them at 68. But the Tigers started their rebuild a little later than Chicago, and their farm system was in even worse shape. So their path to relevance may be a bit longer. They shipped off their best pitcher, Justin Verlander, to Houston last year, and shipped J.D. Martinez off to Arizona, now in Boston. And they also shipped ex-Yankee Justin Wilson off to the Cubs for a couple of prospects. That last one may have been a good deal for Detroit. Wilson ended up struggling in his relief role in Chicago. So all that happened during the season last year. So the Tigers basically ran out of pieces to deal and were pretty quiet this winter, although they made that one deal, that Kinsler trade with the Angels, for whom they got outfield prospect Troy Montgomery and right-handed pitching prospect Wilkel Hernandez. Neither are top-tier guys, but the point there was to unload Ian Kinsler's contract, and the Angels needed a second baseman, so it was a marriage of convenience. Also, Kinsler had a no trade, so Detroit's hands were tied to some extent. But they did save $11 million by not having to pay that final year of Kinsler's contract. The Tigers also acquired a pitcher who performed poorly for the Astros last year, Mike Fiers. He was replaced by Brad Peacock mid-season in Houston's rotation. But Fiers put up good numbers before that dip last year, and he could be a nice bargaining chip for the Tigers come July if he bounces back and some team is looking for a pitcher. The Tigers also signed ex-Blue Jay Francisco Liriano. Actually, he started last season in Toronto's rotation, but then ended up being sent to Houston, where A.J. Hinch used him in the pen. Pretty bad numbers last year, but good numbers against lefties. And again, these acquisitions are bargaining chips for trade deadline deals, not long-term solutions. Now, why they hired Ron Gardenhire as manager is unclear to me. That kind of stuck out this winter because he was one of the few managers hired, maybe the only one, who was older, more experienced, more of an old-school kind of guy. Maybe they wanted a more fatherly type with all these young players. But Gardenhire, who was manager of the year back in 2010, he hasn't actually had a ton of success. Career 1 loss, barely over 500, and his Minnesota teams were always a pretty easy out in the playoffs, usually at the hands of the Yankees. Gardenhire's postseason record is an atrocious 6-21, although certainly the Tigers won't be sniffing the postseason anytime soon. Moving on to yet another rebuilding team, well, let's say quasi-rebuilding, the Kansas City Royals. The Royals were active late, and they were much more active overall than either the White Sox or the Tigers, signing Lucas Duda at the end of last month, 30 homers last year. John Jay, just a couple of weeks ago, a pretty good outfielder, and of course, one of the founding fathers of our great nation. Excellent on-base numbers last season for Jay, although he's lost a lot of his power. And then Mike Moustakas that same week, all one-year deals. Moustakas had a rough offseason. He and his agent, Scott Boras, are denying a rumor going around that they turned down a 3-year, $45 million deal from the Angels. But that 1-year deal he ultimately signed with Kansas City was for just $5.5 million. And I say just, for most of us that would be a pretty monumental windfall. But again, this free agent class was in for a rude surprise. A lot of owners just sat on their hands this winter. I mean, in November, there were predictions that a guy like Moustakas, still young, big power, he hit 38 home runs last year, that he might be able to get, 5 or 6 years and close to $100 million. And the drag for Moustakas is he turned down a qualifying offer from Kansas City for $17.4 million early in the offseason. So the Moose takes a pretty big pay cut and stays on a team that, as I said, is kind of quasi-retooling. Now, part of his bad fortune may stem from the fact that teams wanted to wait a year and bid on Manny Machado, or maybe Boras just overplayed his hand. He's done it before. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Royals end up trading Moustakas for prospects before the deadline. But this offseason, they lost Lorenzo Cain to Milwaukee. Eric Hosmer ends up in San Diego. That's one Boris client who did nicely, financially speaking, although the Padres, that's another bad team. And left-hander Jason Vargas ends up on the Mets. He's now injured. And even though I think Kansas City will end up with more wins than Detroit and Chicago this year, they may in fact be in worse shape long term because their farm system is a shambles, ranked dead last in the majors without any top prospects anywhere near major league readiness. I mean, look, they've been in 2 World Series in the past 5 years, winning one of them. So it's tough to come down too hard on them. And they're a small market team and they've done very well, but it may be a while before they see that kind of success again. Now, as I mentioned earlier, they were part of a deal with the Dodgers and the White Sox, and they ended up with a couple of okay prospects, and they also brought back shortstop Alcides Escobar on a 1-year deal. But although he was on those 2 World Series teams, he wasn't a major contributor, at least not offensively. Solid glove, but last 3 seasons combined, 286 on-base percentage, so bottom of the barrel. So the truth is, it's not entirely correct to say that the Royals are going full-on rebuild like the Tigers and the White Sox. I think ultimately to their detriment, but we'll see. I'm just not sure some of those signings make sense unless they're confident they can deal them for prospects. But my crystal ball tells me short-term, the Royals will not contend, and long-term, it will take them longer than Detroit and Chicago, especially Chicago, to be good again. I'll give them 75 wins, 4 over Vegas. They've got enough talent to win some games, especially in the same division as the White Sox and the Tigers, and then in interleague play, they get to feast on the Reds and the Pirates as well. Moving on to our second-place team, a much happier tale, the Minnesota Twins, who had one of the top 5 off-seasons in the majors, in my opinion, although they just got the bad and somewhat confounding news that shortstop Jorge Polanco tested positive for performing-enhancing drugs and will serve an 80-game suspension. Why anyone thinks they're going to get away with that in this day and age is beyond me. It's just incredibly selfish and incredibly stupid. But he's not exactly one of their big guns. He hit just .256 last year, but a good base stealer, so that's kind of a drag. But the Twins, who are coming off a great year where they played like a house on fire down the stretch, only to be eliminated by the Yankees yet again. But still, for a team that won only 59 games the previous season, it was a truly remarkable turnaround, really one of the best in recent memory. The Twins were one of the teams that benefited from the dismantling of the Rays this offseason and picked up righty Jake Odorizzi, who's always been tough on the Yankees but is coming off a down year. But more importantly, they picked up the very good first baseman Logan Morrison, a career-high 38 home runs last year. Now their ace, Irvin Santana, broke his finger and had to have surgery, so he'll be out 10 to 12 weeks, so that's a big loss. So they signed righty Anibal Sanchez, kind of a reclamation project, to be honest. He's gotten worse every year since he placed 4th in the Cy Young voting in 2013, and he was awful last year. But, they're hoping he can bolster that rotation while Santana is out, and they're also hoping that ex-Yankee Phil Hughes can get it together. He was dreadful last year out of the pen, ERA near 6. But on the pitching front, I think there's more hope for Jose Berrios, 23-year-old hard-throwing righty, who had a strong campaign last year, really his first full season. But with the Twins, no big changes among position players other than the addition of Morrison. A couple of tweaks to the rotation. They signed ex-Yankee Michael Pineda, who, as we saw in New York, is more than capable of going from terrible to all-world to terrible in any 3 consecutive starts, so good luck with that. 2-year deal. Kind of odd, actually, since he's still recovering from Tommy John. But big changes, positive changes to the bullpen. Significant improvement with Addison Reed, who did a great job in Boston last year. Not sure why the Red Sox let him get away. The Twins also signed Fernando Rodney. Less crazy about that deal. He's pushing 40 and hasn't been good for a while, but he can still sling it. He gets up in the mid-90s and he can still strike people out. It's just he walks too many guys. And Zach Duke, a lefty who's very capable of contributing as their lefty specialist out of the pen. I mean, with Cleveland's loss of relievers Joe Smith and Brian Shaw, both very good, I think the Twins bullpen, especially with the Addison Reed signing, is edging closer to Cleveland's at this point. We'll get to the Indians in a minute, but the Twins are doing it right, developing a bunch of really talented homegrown players like third baseman Miguel Sano, 860 OPS, 28 home runs last year, left fielder Eddie Rosario, 27 home runs last year, and a recent addition in Minnesota is a guy we talked about last week in our Cardinals segment, the slightly overrated but dependable Lance Lynn. It was the right move, especially given some health issues on that staff. They needed stability, and Lynn has been to the wars in St. Louis and knows how to pitch. So that's a one-year, $12 million deal. So look, real improvement in Minnesota. I'm giving them 87 wins, 2 over Vegas. Just not enough to catch my pick for first place in the AL Central, a tough team that's also been tough on their fans with postseason flameouts too numerous to mention. The Cleveland Indians. Now, given what I said about their slightly depleted bullpen and the fact that they also lost first baseman Carlos Santana to the Phillies, I'm taking the under on Cleveland by 1.5. I'm giving the Tribe 93 wins, which would be a decline of 9 from last year. Last year, of course, they had that ridiculous 22-game winning streak toward the end of the season. Now, as I concluded in my analysis a couple of weeks ago, the Indians have the best rotation in the American League top to bottom. In fact, it was second only to the Dodgers last year in pretty much every metric, and only barely. And all 5 are coming back. Cy Young winner Corey Kluber, Carlos Carrasco, who led the AL in wins last year with 18, Trevor Bauer, Josh Tomlin, and Mike Clevenger. Cleveland also has a great left side of the infield. And yet, this is not the same Indians team that won 102 games last year. And it's not just the bullpen. They lost 2 big bats that helped catapult them into the elite last year, Jay Bruce and Austin Jackson. Bruce, who split the season between Queens and Cleveland last year and is now a Met once again, 36 home runs last year, 101 RBIs, and Jackson, now in Frisco, excellent on-base percentage last year, 387. So Cleveland's loss is the Mets and the Giants' gain. But probably the biggest loss is the aforementioned Carlos Santana, who's really put up great numbers his entire career. As I mentioned last week, career on base 365, 23 home runs last year, and he's a workhorse. He hasn't missed major playing time since he came up in 2010. So his replacement at first, Yonder Alonso, he's a perfectly good player. And he did hit 20 home runs in the first half last year in Oakland, but then he tailed off dramatically after he was traded to Seattle, just hit 8 in the second half. And he has just atrocious numbers against lefty pitchers, hit just 181 against lefties last year. So that's a drop-off for sure offensively. And defensively, that's a major drop-off. Alonso is not a good defensive first baseman by any stretch of the imagination. And Santana is phenomenal. He was a Gold Glove finalist last year, losing out to the excellent Eric Hosmer. So while they still have enough remaining to fend off Minnesota, including 2 absolute beasts in the bullpen, Andrew Miller and Cody Allen, these downgrades and the fact that Minnesota has improved led me to take the under on Cleveland. So big picture in the AL Central, 2 have-nots in Chicago and Detroit, 2 haves in Cleveland and Minnesota, and the Royals are kind of stuck in the mediocre middle. Back in a moment.
And now the answer to today's Bronx Bombers trivia question. Which Yankee is in second place behind Mickey Mantle with 15 World Series home runs? The answer? A. Babe Ruth. And now here's Joe.
All right, last but certainly not least, your American League East. Again, similar to the other 2 divisions in that you've got 2 contenders on top and 3 lesser teams. Although, in my opinion, the 3 lesser teams in our division aren't nearly as bad as the bottom 3 in the Central, for example. And I differ from both Vegas and Fangraphs, no surprise there, on who will bring up the rear. They've both got Baltimore in the basement, but my choice for 5th place is the Tampa Bay Rays, who must have taken a southward glance at Miami and liked what they saw from Derek Jeter's Marlins this winter, because they dealt away the overwhelming majority of their offensive talent this offseason, including the aforementioned Logan Morrison to Minnesota, Steven Souza to Arizona, he's now injured, Evan Longoria to Frisco, and outfielder Corey Dickerson to Pittsburgh. I talked about those latter 3 deals in last week's segment on the National League, but a big-time sell-off in Tampa, and why I have them in last place. No real pitching other than starter Chris Archer and closer Alex Colomé. And before losing Odorizzi and Alex Cobb, Tampa was dead last in ERA last year at 5.7. Think about that. An average ERA of 5.7 on their starting staff. And with all these deals they've made, the reviews, as far as the prospects they've gotten in return for some of these big stars, aren't exactly glowing. And the veterans they picked up, Denard Span from the Giants, for example, in that Longoria trade, aren't really game changers. But they still have Kevin Kiermaier, maybe the best defensive outfielder in the game today. And although Tampa has not drafted well in recent years, they've built up an excellent farm system, ranked 5th actually in all of baseball. So just as long as they avoid getting tied up with any more long contracts and prioritize building up their young players, and that does seem to be the path they've chosen, and that's a good path, Tampa has a shot at relevance in maybe 2 to 3 years. But as far as 2018, I mean, they could be hobbled right out of the gate. They play Boston like 13 times in the first few weeks of the season. That's Major League Baseball's gift to the Red Sox. So the Rays could be sitting in the cellar in short order. So I'm giving them 76 wins, 1.5 under Vegas. Which brings us to my 4th place team by a hair. All these bottom 3 teams are bunched up. But I've got the Orioles in 4th, picked up a couple of decent starters this offseason, signing Andrew Cashner in February, 2 years, $16 million, and the aforementioned Alex Cobb just a couple of weeks ago, 4 years, $57 million. And man, does Baltimore need pitching in the worst way. Now, as far as why I differ from Vegas and have them ahead of Tampa, it's simple. They have more talent. With the great Manny Machado at 3rd. Actually, he's a shortstop this year, his natural position. They have the reliable Adam Jones in center, 28 home runs last year, and a breakout 2017 for Jonathan Scope. 32 home runs, 105 RBIs. Scope's a good defensive second baseman as well. And look, they've got power. First baseman Chris Davis, left fielder Trey Mancini, DH Mark Trumbo. As a team, they only hit 9 fewer than the Yankees last year, who led the majors, which on the surface makes their last place finish last year puzzling. Just 75 wins, a 14-win decline from 2016, but it's not much of a puzzle. As I outlined in episode 3, their pitching has been a total mess, a mixture of injuries and horrendous organizational decisions, and their farm system is one of the worst in baseball, so they had to go free agent this winter as far as pitching. And as I predicted in that earlier episode, they picked up 2 starters, Cashner and Cobb, both pretty good. Now, do I think this is ultimately a positive direction for the organization to go the free agent route every year? No. Championship teams nowadays are building from within, but Baltimore can't do that. They have no within. Again, atrocious farm system. So for now, they're one of these teams like Texas and St. Louis stuck in the middle, not contending, but not quite raising the white flag either, which, given the fact that the Red Sox and the Yankees are so much better, much more complete teams, to me, that approach doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially given the fact that they're bound to lose Machado a year from now, if not sooner. If Peter Angelos does not deal Machado before the deadline and get something out of it, that to me is a fireable offense. Unfortunately, Angelos is the owner, so he'd need to fire himself, which would be an unusual turn of events. But even with Cashner and Cobb, again, neither of whom I'd call frontline starters, just serviceable, they're still not going to get Zach Britton until June at the earliest, and the rest of their rotation remains poor, with Chris Tillman and his bloated 7.84 ERA last year. Dylan Bundy, a little less awful, but he's looked bad this spring. 15 innings, ERA of 9, and Kevin Gausman, ERA close to 5 last year, all coming off bad seasons. I mean, if all these guys improved a bit over last year, this would still be a bad staff. But again, Orioles have a significantly better lineup than Tampa with a ton of power, and with pitching, given Tampa's loss of Cobb and Odorizzi, I'd say Baltimore's pitching is probably on a par with Tampa at this point. So again, I'm sticking Baltimore in 4th place. I'll give them 77 wins. That's 4 over Vegas at 73. And I did check to see if Vegas had upped that bid since the Cobb signing, but they haven't. They're still at 73. But if the O's start slow and then deal Machado and maybe even Adam Jones, they could very well finish at the bottom, and the pros will beat the Joes on this pick. Moving on to my choice for third place, another team in baseball purgatory, the Toronto Blue Jays, who we face tomorrow in the season opener. Severino takes the hill against J.A. Happ. Toronto, as bad as they were last year, were the only team in our division to have a winning record against us, and that's something that's got to change, hopefully starting tomorrow. Now, despite a terrible year last year, it's not impossible that the Blue Jays do better than last year on the pitching front. Right-hander Aaron Sanchez had serious ongoing blister issues last year. They only got 8 starts out of him, but he's back healthy and blister-free. Now, they had a scare this month with their ace, Marcus Stroman. He had some shoulder inflammation this spring, which is why he's not pitching tomorrow, but he should be back in short order. J.A. Happ, I always want to call him AJ. That's much more common and much more easy to say, but no, it's J.A. We'll see J.A. Happ tomorrow. And he's a pretty good lefty. Some elbow issues last year, but 2 years ago went 20-4, 3.18 ERA, 163 strikeouts in almost 200 innings. Although for our sake, tomorrow, let's hope that kind of dominance is long gone. Toronto also added lefty Jaime Garcia, briefly a Yankee last year and entirely forgettable. But still, the Toronto staff isn't bad. It's middle of the road. And middle of the road is enough to put them a cut above Baltimore and Tampa, in my opinion. All 5 Jays starters, Stroman, Happ, Estrada, Sanchez, and even Garcia, are projected to have a better ERA than the league average, but Toronto's lineup is questionable at best, with 2 of their heavy hitters, Tulowitzki and Donaldson, coming off injury-plagued seasons, and Tulowitzki, who's dealing with a bone spur in his right heel, a la Greg Bird, will not be in the lineup tomorrow. Actually, I don't think we'll see him at all this weekend. I mean, they've got some competent veterans. They signed ex-Yankee Curtis Granderson, and actually Donaldson, if he stays healthy, could have a big year. His second half last year was phenomenal, but it's an aging roster. Russell Martin, Kendrys Morales, Granderson, Tulowitzki, all in their mid-30s. So a middle-of-the-road team, that's my prediction. I'm taking the over on Toronto. Vegas has them at 81. I'm saying 83, largely on the strength of a healthier rotation and Donaldson healthy as well. They could even be the best third-place team in baseball, actually. Certainly in the American League, I think they'll be better than Kansas City and Seattle, but not in reach of catching my second-place finisher, the Boston Red Sox. One thing about Boston, and look, I'm very optimistic that the Yankees will come out of the gate very strong. But as I mentioned, Boston's schedule, April into May, is like a very long buffet table of assorted cream puffs. Check this out. In their first 16 games, they get Tampa for 6, Miami for 2, and Baltimore for 4. The only good team they play is the Yankees during that stretch. And into May, they get more Tampa, Kansas City, and Oakland. So don't be surprised if Boston is close to or ahead of us in the standings out of the gate. But look, eventually, you got to play everybody, right? And it's my firm belief that the natural order of the universe will once again be restored, and we will come out on top. But with Boston, I'm saying good, not great. Well, that's not fair. I'll say very good, but with serious questions. I think that's more accurate. See, it's tough to be objective. I hate the Red Sox so much, but I'll do my best. Look, they're coming off back-to-back AL East titles. They've won a total of 186 regular season games the last 2 years. They are certainly a very good team. On the other hand, they've certainly been a very bad postseason team in recent years. They got manhandled by the Astros last year, who clinched at Fenway. And the year before that, they got swept by the Indians. That was the one with the David Price implosion in Game 2. And last year, we had the Chris Sale implosion in Game 1. Both of those implosions I enjoyed immensely, by the way. Also, on the one hand, they've got a talented lineup, no question, with Betts, Benintendi, Hanley Ramirez, and now J.D. Martinez. On the other hand, 2 of those guys, Betts and Ramirez, underperformed last season. Mookie's batting average dipped from 318 to 264, power dropped as well, and Ramirez, who's getting on in years, 34 years old now, he was worse. He hit just 242, power numbers down also. We also saw varying levels of decline from shortstop Xander Bogaerts and outfielder Jackie Bradley. And with J.D. Martinez, as I've said, he's a very, very good hitter, but I think his numbers last year were inflated by Chase Field. the best hitter's park in the majors other than Coors Field. Very different numbers for JD on the road. But all in all, that was a good pickup. I think they needed power and they got it. But at a price. Boston now has the highest payroll in baseball. They knocked the Dodgers off the top spot, and the Yankees are now 7th highest. That's the lowest ranking since 1992. So we're moving in the right direction. They are moving in the wrong direction as far as money tied up in expensive veterans. Their pitching remains a question mark. Price has never had a complete season in Boston. He's been plagued by elbow problems. He's taking up a massive chunk of that bloated payroll and is a head case to boot. Sale was great last year, but has a well-documented tendency to tail off in the second half and was awful in the playoffs, as I said. And with the others, injury issues abound. Their second-best pitcher last year, Drew Pomerantz, is now sidelined with a flexor strain. He'll likely miss some starts and has a history of arm and shoulder troubles. Lefty Eduardo Rodriguez, who I think has good potential, won't be pitching the first month coming off knee surgery, and Stephen Wright, who was arrested on domestic assault charges in December, which Major League Baseball looked into and announced on Saturday that he'll be suspended for 15 games, and Porcello was healthy last year, but mediocre. I mean, if their top four, Sale, Price, Pomerantz, Rodriguez, was 100% healthy and firing on all cylinders, and Porcello was at least okay, then maybe you could say, well, yeah, that's a rotation that's comparable to the Yankees. But the reality is they're neither 100% healthy, not even close, and they have not been firing on all cylinders, and I would take the Yankees rotation every day of the week and twice on Sunday over Boston's. But the health issues don't end with their rotation. Dustin Pedroia, Apple Watch guy, won't be back until June after off-season knee surgery. And remember, J.D. Martinez also has a lengthy injury history. He hasn't had an injury-free season since 2015, and he'll be 31 in August. So that could be yet another contract the Red Sox live to regret. 5 years, $110 million. Benintendi in left field, Andrew Benintendi, I like. I thought he had a really good rookie season. It wasn't a surprise. Everybody had him pegged as the top prospect in baseball and prohibitive Rookie of the Year favorite until Aaron Judge happened. But he's really good and only 23. So the Red Sox, plenty of potential, but very much a mixed bag. The good news for Yankee fans is they have enough issues so that I don't think they're going to catch us, but they're certainly good enough that we'll see competitive series this year. And I think when the Yankees and the Red Sox are both good, it's good for baseball. I certainly enjoy it. But with the Red Sox, given some of these issues, I'm taking the under, barely. Vegas has them at a reasonable 91.5. I'll give them 91. But 91 will not be enough wins, in my book, to match what I think will be a spectacular season for the New York Yankees, your first-place finisher in the American League East. I've got the Yanks at 97 wins, 2.5 over Vegas. 97 would be one better than Houston in the American League, and one better than Washington in the National, so good enough for home field advantage throughout the playoffs and World Series, should the baseball gods smile upon us once again. I've talked about the Yankees for hours on this podcast, so I'll try to keep this direct and to the point. We have the most power in the majors. We clearly have the best bullpen in the majors, and our staff, while maybe a tick behind the Indians, is right there with Houston's, in my opinion, and plenty good enough to carry us to 97 wins with our lineup. In fact, I wouldn't be at all shocked if we hit the century mark this year. And as I've pointed out, this is all ahead of schedule. Remember, last year was supposed to be a transition with growing pains, and we were only supposed to maybe contend this year. But apparently the Yankees did not get that memo, and Aaron Judge happened. Judge led all Major League players last year in wins above replacement. Gary Sanchez happened. Gary missed a month last year with a biceps injury and still managed to lead all catchers in home runs. And I think he's every bit the hitter that Aaron Judge is. And by the way, there was a fascinating article last Friday in the New York Times by Billy Witz on everything that Sanchez and the Yankees have been doing this offseason to address his pitch blocking issues. I highly recommend it. Really fascinating. They go into a new workout regimen that they believe will improve flexibility, and the Yankees Yankees' new catching coach, Jason Brown, it sounds like he's definitely on point with all this, and Sanchez has been working very hard as well. And I'd be surprised if we don't see improvement this year. I've watched a bunch of games this spring, and I think I only saw one or two pass balls, and one of them was a bouncer like a foot in front of the plate. But anyway, Sanchez happened, Luis Severino happened. Severino finished third in the Cy Young voting last year after a dominating year, especially the second half when he was borderline unhittable. Chad Green happened. Chad Green, for my money, is the best setup man in the American League. Jordan Montgomery happened. Monty led all rookie pitchers in wins above replacement. And I think, to quote Frank Sinatra, the best is yet to come. We saw brilliant trades by Brian Cashman. We've got an incredible farm system. Hard to overstate how many quality players we have in Double and Triple A. And, here we are once again on familiar ground, legitimate contenders for a world title under the luxury tax threshold, with plenty of payroll flexibility to make this team even better in July. So we are set up, my friends, and it's going to be a lot of fun to watch these guys over the next few years. I like the infield moves Cashman made in the last month or so, a clever trade for Brandon Drury, who's had a very, very strong spring, 47 plate appearances, on base 362, OPS over 800, and strong with the glove. Picking up Neil Walker on the cheap I also liked, and he's a really good defensive second baseman. I watched the game a couple days ago against the Braves. He was flashing the leather in a big way. And Tyler Wade, as I said last week, has been a revelation. And I have a hunch he'll get some Rookie of the Year votes come season's end. Check this out. 48 plate appearances this spring, on-base percentage 438, tremendous plate discipline. The whole team has had tremendous plate discipline. They've walked more than any other team so far in spring training. Very good glove and an absolute speed demon, stretching doubles into triples on a routine basis. And look, I get that these are exhibition games. We all have a tendency to overreact to the good stuff, and if we see something bad, we ignore it. And speaking of bad, we got some more bad news on the injury front with Greg Bird. Sound familiar? And he had surgery yesterday to remove a small broken spur, which I guess is a kind of bony outgrowth on the outside of his right ankle, and he'll be out 6 to 8 weeks. So look, I'm sure Bird is more frustrated than anyone that he's going to miss, serious playing time once again due to injury. But, he's going to have this label on him of being fragile until he can go out and play at least a season or two for a complete season. It is what it is. And as far as our new manager, Aaron Boone, in the brief time he's been here, I like what I've seen. Although he sort of indicated last week that he's going to split up Judge, Stanton, and Sanchez in the lineup, which I think is a bad idea. But those things are always changing, and I think he's handled the prospects and this fluid infield situation very well, and just seems like a positive guy, which is frankly a breath of fresh air after a decade of Girardi, who, with all due respect, and I mean that, he won here a lot. But, he seemed to have the weight of the world on his shoulders, visibly so, and I think that tension radiated throughout the clubhouse based on what I've read. But as far as Boone, anytime you can pencil in Judge, 52 home runs last year, followed by Stanton, 59, followed by Sanchez, 33, never mind Didi and Hicks and all the others. I mean, if you're a pitcher facing the Yankees lineup, you've got a potential horror show on your hands. And like I said, don't be surprised if we're even better once that August 1st trading deadline has come and gone. So there it is, my friends. We have done it all. The numbers have been crunched, the hardcore analysis has been presented, and just to wrap it up for all those scoring at home, AL West, I've got Houston in first at 96 wins, Angels in second at 85, Mariners in third, 78, Rangers hot on their trail at 77, and Oakland pulling up the rear once again with 76. In the Central, Cleveland on top with 93 wins, Twins within shouting distance at 87, Royals in third with 75, and then the two cellar dwellers, Tigers in fourth with 69 wins, Chicago with 66. Back in our neck of the woods, the Yankees are the beasts of the East with 97 wins, Boston in second with 91, Jays a distant third with 83, Baltimore with 77, Tampa with 76, which, if I'm right, would mean the Yankees, the Indians, and the Astros would be playing in the ALDS once again, and the wild card game would be hosted by the Red Sox, who would face the Minnesota Twins, although I would not be totally shocked to see the Angels there instead of Minnesota. Now, my biggest difference is with Vegas. I think Vegas came in too low on Minnesota and Kansas City. I'm 4.5 over on the Twins, 3.5 on Kansas City. And in the West, Vegas is too high on Seattle, in my opinion. I'm 3.5 under. And in the East, I believe Vegas is underselling Baltimore. Again, with their power and now a decent 1-2 in that rotation, 73 wins is too few. I'm giving the Orioles 77. And by the way, we'll revisit these win total picks of mine come October and see how I did with my over and under picks. And so there it is, my friends, 15 teams, your 2018 American League. Back in a moment. And that'll do it for this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. Again, don't forget, subscribe via iTunes and Stitcher. Follow us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle. Like us on Facebook as well. Have a fantastic opening day. And most of all, have faith in the Yankees. We'll see you again in 2 weeks.